Ada for telling my sister-in-law that her boyfriend needs to move out of the house. When I made the decision to buy a house with my wife, it was supposed to be a step toward stability, security, and building something that was truly ours. It was a place to create memories, to build our future together, to have a space that reflected our choices and values. But life has a way of twisting plans in unexpected directions, and what was meant to be our home slowly transformed into something else entirely, something I could barely recognize. At the time of the purchase, I was living overseas for work. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was a necessary one. The opportunity was too good to pass up, and in the long run, it would provide us with the financial security we needed. It made sense for my wife to stay back, to continue living her life in familiar surroundings while I handled things from afar. We agreed on that. What we didn't agree on, what I had no control over, was what she would do with the house in my absence. While I was away, my wife's sister found herself in a difficult situation. She had 2 kids and nowhere else to go. I don't blame my wife for wanting to help her sister. It was the kind of thing a caring person would do. Family should support family. And so, in my absence, my wife opened our home to them. But it didn't stop there. The sister's boyfriend, a man I had never met, also moved in. A man who, by all accounts, contributed very little to the household, yet seemed to have taken the greatest liberty in claiming the space as his own. From the moment he entered the house, he gravitated toward the garage, and it didn't take long before he declared it his domain. My wife, never having much use for the garage herself, didn't object. She barely noticed. It was just a space to her, somewhere to store tools and old boxes, a place she rarely stepped foot in. But to him, it became something else, a private retreat, a sanctuary, a refuge where he could withdraw from the rest of the household and live by his own rules. At first, I only heard about it through my wife in passing conversation. She would mention small things, never fully addressing the situation, as though it were an insignificant detail in the grander scheme of life. She would say, "He spends most of his time in the garage," or "He doesn't really like eating with us," as though these were quirks, nothing more than personal preferences. But the picture that emerged over time was unsettling. This wasn't a man simply using the garage as a workspace or a place to store his belongings. He had made it his living quarters. He spent his days there, isolated, closed off from the rest of the house. He slept there more often than not, emerging only when he had to, when work called, when hunger forced him to raid the refrigerator, when nature's demands pushed him toward the bathroom. The family ate meals together, but he was always absent. He never took a seat at the table, never joined in conversations, never participated in any of the moments that made a house feel like a home. He existed in the periphery, a shadow hovering at the edge of the household, always present but never truly part of it. When I returned home after nearly 3 years away, I had expected some adjustments. I knew things wouldn't be exactly the way I had left them. But nothing could have prepared me for how much my own house had become unrecognizable to me. The garage, my garage, had become his fortress. There was no space for me there anymore. The moment I set foot in it, I realized it was no longer a part of my house. It had been transformed, piece by piece, into his personal hideaway. A couch, a TV, scattered belongings, evidence of a life lived entirely separate from the rest of the household. And my wife? She had long since accepted it. To her, it was simply the way things were. It had been this way for so long that she no longer saw it as an intrusion, as something strange or unacceptable. It was just the normal state of affairs, something that had settled into place over time, like a stone sinking into the earth. But I couldn't accept it. I wouldn't accept it. This was my home. And yet, from the very beginning, I was made to feel like an outsider in my own space. For nearly 2 years, I had been living in a house that barely felt like my own. The return from overseas should have been a homecoming, a moment of relief after years away, but instead, it was as if I had walked into someone else's life. The walls still stood where I had left them, the furniture was familiar, but the atmosphere had changed in ways I couldn't ignore. The presence of my wife's sister and her 2 children was something I could understand. Family looks out for family. But the man in the garage? The one who had turned it into his personal sanctuary, shutting himself away like some self-proclaimed exile? That was a problem. I tried to adapt, tried to let it slide. But every day I felt more like a guest in my own home, and every day that garage, the one place I could have reclaimed as my own, remained his territory. He rarely left it except for work or the necessities of life. He existed in the shadows of the house, skirting around interactions, avoiding meals, treating the household like a resource rather than a shared space. And yet, for all his reluctance to be involved in the family, he clung to that garage like it was the last refuge he had. At my wife's urging, I began looking into the possibility of buying a second home. It wasn't ideal, but if it meant peace, if it meant finally regaining the space that should have been mine, it seemed worth considering. The idea was simple: buy another property, let my wife's sister and her family move into it, have them rent from us, and finally reclaim the home I had worked for. It was supposed to be a win-win situation. For a while, it seemed like it could work. They agreed to pay $700 a month in rent, a reasonable amount, given the circumstances. It wouldn't make up for all the inconvenience, but at least it would be something. But month after month, they came up short. Not by a small amount, not by something that could be brushed aside. Every single month, they fell behind by at least $200, sometimes as much as $400. And every single month, there was a new excuse. We had unexpected expenses this month. The kids needed school supplies. There was an emergency. It was always something. I could feel my patience thinning with each passing month, but what was I supposed to do? Throw them out? Put my wife in a position where she had to choose between her family and me? That wasn't a battle I wanted to fight, not yet, anyway. So I let it go. Again. And again. But then came the motorcycle. It had been a long time coming. A project I had wanted to take on for years. A way to finally put some of my time and energy into something that was mine. The garage, my garage, was the perfect place for it. Or, at least, it should have been. I remember the day I brought it home. I pulled into the driveway, anticipation running through me. The motorcycle wasn't much to look at in its current state, old, battered, a restoration project if there ever was one, but I had plans for it. I could already see the finished result in my head, sleek, powerful, something that reflected the effort I was willing to put in. I just needed space to work on it. I had been clear with him. I told him that the garage had to be cleared out, that he needed to make room. I wasn't asking for the entire space, just enough for my tools, enough to maneuver, enough to do what needed to be done. He agreed. Of course, he agreed. And then, nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. The garage remained exactly as it had been. His things still sprawled across the space, his so-called man cave untouched. I tried reminding him, polite at first, measured. Hey, man, you remember what we talked about? But every time, he had some excuse. Yeah, I'll get to it. I've just been busy with work. I need to figure out where to put everything. Then a month went by. Then 2. Still, nothing changed. I found myself fuming every time I walked past the garage door, knowing what was behind it. Knowing that my request, my reasonable, simple request, had been ignored. He wasn't just slow to act, he was refusing to act. I confronted him again, trying to push the matter. You said you'd make space. Yeah, I know. So why hasn't anything moved? I just don't have anywhere to put my stuff, man. Then stack it in a corner. Put it in storage. Do something. Yeah, I'll figure it out. But he didn't. Instead, he dug in deeper, solidified his position. He stayed in the garage more. slept there more. It was as if my request had made him even more determined to claim the space as his own. And then he had the audacity to act as if I was the one being unreasonable. One night, as I was walking past the kitchen toward the garage door, I heard him muttering under his breath. A quiet, frustrated voice, meant for himself but loud enough that I caught the words. I don't even like living here. I stopped in my tracks. I turned to face him. Then why are you still here? He looked up, caught off guard. His expression twisted into something defensive, like a cornered animal. What? You just said you don't like living here. So why don't you leave? He scoffed, shook his head. It's not that simple. Seems pretty simple to me. His jaw clenched. He stared at me, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. And then, for the first time, the hostility that had been simmering beneath the surface broke through. He took a step closer, his shoulders squared. Maybe you should be the one to leave, he said. I almost laughed. Almost. You're joking, right? He didn't blink. I've been here for this long. Now, all of a sudden, everything has to change. Yes. Because it's my house. You weren't even here when we moved in. And now I am. And things are going to change. His fists clenched at his sides. Yeah? And what if I don't move my stuff? What if I don't leave? Then I'll move it for you. That's when he lost it. His face darkened, his body tensed, and then the words came, sharp, venomous, meant to provoke. I ought to kick your ass. For a split second, the air between us felt charged, on the verge of snapping. I had dealt with men like him before. The kind who talk big but rarely follow through. Still, something in me flared up, something instinctual, something territorial. This was my home. My space. And he had just made the mistake of threatening me in it. But I didn't react. Not immediately. Instead, I took a slow breath, measured, deliberate. I didn't step back. I didn't look away. Instead, I leveled my voice, steady and low. Say that again. He hesitated. I could see the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew he had crossed a line. He knew I wouldn't back down. But instead of apologizing, instead of de-escalating, he did what cowards always do. He deflected. Talk to your sister-in-law, he muttered, turning away. I don't want to talk to you. Coward. That was the moment I knew. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to respect me, my house, or my patience. I had given him time. Too much time. And now? Now, he was out of time. The tension in the house had reached an unbearable boiling point. Every day that passed without change was another nail in the coffin of my patience. I had given him time. More than enough time. I had been clear. Crystal clear. Move his stuff out of the garage. Make room. Do something to acknowledge that this wasn't just his personal cave to linger in indefinitely. Mid-December had come and gone. 3 weeks had stretched into a month. Then another 2 weeks. And now, we were well over a month and a half past the deadline. At first, I had reasoned with myself, convinced myself that patience would win out. That if I just let him take his time, he would come to his senses, pack up, and move on. That was a mistake. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was defiance. He wasn't just failing to act. He was choosing not to act. Every interaction we had became more frustrating than the last. He kept repeating the same things, like some broken record with an attitude problem. I don't even like living here. Then leave. I'll move my stuff out, I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Then get around to it. I don't have anywhere to put it. Then find somewhere. But the worst was when he pretended to be the victim. I don't understand why things have to change now. I've been here this long. Because it's my house. Because I live here now. Because you should have left a long time ago. But saying it outright wasn't going to change anything. He had long since learned to play the game. As much as I despised him, I had to give him credit. He knew exactly how to stall. How to avoid confrontation while still being a constant problem. How to make excuses just convincing enough to avoid immediate consequences. The problem wasn't just him. It was the dynamic. The moment he threw my sister-in-law into the mix, everything became even more complicated. Talk to your sister-in-law, he said. Coward. He knew damn well she would defend him. She always did. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe she felt responsible for dragging him here in the first place. Maybe she just didn't want to deal with a fight. Or maybe, deep down, she was just as comfortable leeching off of me as he was. Because let's be real, this was never meant to be permanent. She had moved in with her kids because she needed help. Fine. But that should have been temporary. A stepping stone. Not an indefinite occupation. And yet, here we were. 3 bedrooms taken. My garage occupied. My patience stretched thin. And for what? To be the bad guy in my own house? To feel like an intruder? Enough. I had to draw the line. So I pointed out the obvious. Again. You keep saying you're moving out, right? Yeah. Then why not pack your stuff up now? Silence. I pressed forward. Stack it in a corner. Store it somewhere. Hell, put it in a storage unit. I had to do that because of you. And then came the excuses. Again. Storage units are expensive. So is a house. And I'm paying for that. He just shook his head, frustrated but still unwilling to actually do anything about it. But I wasn't playing this game anymore. Listen, I said, finality in my voice this time. I've given you enough time. If you don't start moving your stuff out, I'll move it for you. That got his attention. His eyes darkened. His jaw clenched. You can't just throw my stuff out. Try me. The moment had arrived. The decision was made. There was no more room for hesitation, no more space for diplomacy. He was leaving today. The night before had been a breaking point not just for me, but for the entire dynamic in the house. The tension had been simmering for months, thick and oppressive, filling every room with unspoken conflict. But when he stormed off, slamming the garage door behind him like a spoiled child denied his favorite toy, it was no longer unspoken. It was war. And when I woke up the next morning, I saw it for exactly what it was. A battle for territory. The final stand. I stepped into the hallway, stretching out the stiffness from another restless night. I could already feel the tightness in my shoulders before I even got to the kitchen. It was like my body knew what was coming before my mind had fully processed it. I grabbed a mug, poured some coffee, and tried to give myself a few moments of quiet. But my eyes drifted toward the garage door. A dull, steady hum of noise seeped through the walls, the unmistakable sound of a television. He was still there. Still holed up. Still treating my home like his personal bunker. I set my coffee down and walked over, pressing my palm against the cool surface of the garage door. Then, I reached for the handle and twisted. Locked. Not just shut. Locked. From the inside. My breath left me in a slow, steady exhale. So that's how it was going to be. He wasn't just refusing to leave. He was doubling down. He was digging in. My jaw clenched as I rapped my knuckles against the door, hard. No answer. I knocked again. Louder. Still nothing. He was inside. He could hear me. I could hear his damn television playing. He was ignoring me. The audacity of it hit me like a fist to the chest. The sheer level of entitlement. The complete lack of respect. Enough. I turned and strode straight to the kitchen, where my wife was rinsing out a dish. She glanced up at me, sensing my mood before I even said a word. "He's out," I said. "Now." Her shoulders tensed. I cut her off. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want another excuse. I don't care if it makes things uncomfortable. I don't care what your sister says." I lined out. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just don't want to cause." I let out a sharp breath, forcing myself to calm down, to keep my voice level. "He threatened me," I said flatly. "Is that not enough?" Her face changed. I saw it, the flicker of doubt, of realization. She had been so wrapped up in trying to keep the peace, trying to smooth things over, that she hadn't truly let herself acknowledge what was happening. But now she did. Because this wasn't about just a disagreement. This wasn't just about the garage. This was about control. It was about boundaries. It was about the fact that I had given more patience than anyone in my situation ever should have, and in return, I had been treated like a guest in my own home. She didn't argue anymore. Instead, she simply nodded. "I'll talk to my sister," she said. But I already knew what was coming. Because at this point, her sister wasn't the problem anymore. Escalation. I gave her the space to talk to her sister, though I already knew how the conversation would go. I knew the words before they were spoken. "He just needs more time. He doesn't have anywhere to go. You can't just throw someone out." It didn't matter. I had tried. I had been more than fair. And now, it was time for action. While they talked, I made a call. A legal call. I explained the situation, every detail: the unauthorized occupation, the refusal to move his things, the fact that he had no lease, no legal right to the property, and the threats. The moment I mentioned those, I felt the conversation shift. I wasn't just dealing with a bad house guest anymore. This was now a safety issue. And the law? The law was on my side. The officer on the line didn't hesitate. "Sir, you have every right to remove him from your property." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. But something close. I thanked them and hung up. Then I walked to the garage, my steps deliberate, controlled. I knocked one last time. This time, I wasn't asking. The showdown. The door swung open just a crack, and there he was standing in the dim light, looking half asleep and irritated. "What do you want?" he muttered. I kept my voice calm. Steady. "You need to pack your things." His eyes narrowed. "You can't just." "I can," I cut him off. "And I am." Silence. Then, the resistance. The argument I had been expecting. "I don't have anywhere to put my stuff. This is ridiculous. I've been here for too long for you to just kick me out." I let him finish. And then I said exactly what needed to be said. "This isn't a debate." His posture stiffened. "I've spoken to the police," I continued. "You have no legal right to this space. You've been given more than enough time. Now, you have two choices. You can pack your things and leave on your own, or I can have officers here within the hour to escort you out." His face darkened. "You wouldn't do that." I met his stare, unflinching. "Try me." Another silence. And then I saw it. The shift. The realization. He knew he had lost. He had to go. His jaw clenched, hands tightening into fists, but I didn't move. Didn't react. And finally, he did the only thing left for him to do. He turned and started packing his things. Freedom. It took him less than an hour. Less time than I had spent arguing with him over months. He threw his belongings into bags, stuffed whatever he could into his car. And for the first time in years, The garage was empty. When he finally walked past me, heading for his car, he stopped. He turned, anger still simmering beneath the surface. "You know what? Screw you, man." I didn't respond. Because his words? They meant nothing. He had lost. He knew it. And that was enough. I watched as he got in his car. He slammed the door. And then he was gone. Aftermath. That night, the house felt different. Lighter. As if something heavy had finally been lifted. I walked into the garage, looking at the empty space, at the walls that were finally bare, at the floor that was finally mine again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. For the first time in years, I felt at peace in my own home. And that made every second of the struggle worth it. He was. And he had just locked himself in my garage. The confrontation. By the time I got back to the garage, my blood was boiling. I pounded on the door again, louder. Still no response. Fine. I walked to the side door, the one leading from inside the house to the garage. I had the key. I twisted it locked from the inside. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I stepped back. Took a breath. And then I did what I should have done a long time ago. I walked straight outside, grabbed a wrench, and marched to the garage's main door. I raised the wrench high and I slammed it into the lock. Once. Twice. 3 times. The lock snapped. The door rattled. And then, with one final shove, it rolled open. Face to face. He was standing there. Waiting. I could see it in his face, the realization that he had lost. He had expected me to back down. To play the waiting game. Not this time. I stepped inside, slowly, deliberately. "This ends now," I said, my voice steady. "Get your stuff. And get out." He opened his mouth, probably to throw another excuse, another reason, another stall tactic. I cut him off. "No more talking. No more waiting. You move your stuff out, or I move it for you. And if I move it, it's going on the curb." Silence. Then, finally I saw it. Not anger. Not defiance. Defeat. He knew it was over. And this time, there was nothing he could do about it. The decision was tough, but there was no other choice. He had to leave. I had been patient, given him time, and tried to resolve everything peacefully. But nothing changed. His presence in the house had become increasingly invasive, and when he allowed himself to make threats, that was the final straw. I realized he believed he had a claim to this space just because he had been there long enough to feel comfortable. He thought that if he simply waited it out and resisted enough, he could stay. But he was wrong. The final decision. I didn't act impulsively. I knew this situation needed to be handled carefully because people who avoid responsibility don't leave easily. I gave myself a night to think. And when I woke up the next morning, my decision was clear. He needed to pack his things and leave today. Talking to my wife. In the kitchen, my wife was already making coffee. When I walked in, she looked at me tired, as if she already knew what I was going to say. "He has to go today." She hesitated. "I'll talk to my sister," she finally said. But I already knew that her sister wasn't the only issue. Taking the official route. I picked up my phone and did what I should have done a long time ago. I consulted a lawyer to understand my rights as the homeowner. They asked me if he had any legal documents proving his residence here. "No," I replied. "No lease, no bills in his name, nothing." That was a crucial point. If he had been an official tenant, the process could have been complicated. But legally, he was just a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I now had the information I needed. And with that, I was ready to take action. The final notice. I walked straight to the garage door. I knocked. No response. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I knew he was inside. Enough was enough. I called out, "You have until the end of the day to start moving your things, or I'll move them for you." No answer. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I turned, walked back inside, and prepared for the next step. This was the day everything changed.